I made the comment on the channel a few times that if you just divided the cost of comics in half, we go from $3.99, so basically $4. We'll keep it even, and we say, all right, comics are now going to cost $2. That would be bad for the economy of comics in the short term. It feels like there's a lot of disclaimers here. I stand by that, but a couple of people have questioned it. So I want to explain why I say that and what the factors are. More importantly, how do we fix it? Hey, everybody, this is Perch. The topic of comic pricing is an interesting one because, for the record, it's a good place to start from. I think comics are too expensive. I think in terms of being able to compete with today's, entertainment options and kind of the modern world in general, that comics are just too high. And they can't sustain like this, particularly with so much of our entertainment going streaming and a la carte, or sorry, all you can eat kind of methods. It's just not viable to have this, this idea that, if, for example, the new Ten of Swords storyline that's coming out is going to cost somewhere between $85 and $100 to buy all of it. And now that's a lot of money to get a story. Now, if you think about it in terms of a big movie, and that's how the comic creators themselves have talked about it, that an event, a single comic is not equivalent to an entire movie. Joe Quesada tried making that argument at one point. I think it was kind of just laughed out of the room. But if you think about something like Civil War, the comic, or Dawn of X, Powers of 10, that is equivalent to a movie. A 2 to 2.5 hour big budget film. And I think that's a reasonable, assumption to make. But if a movie costs you $10 and the storyline costs you 50 to 60, it's not a great trade-off. And I think this is tough for people in the comic industry to understand because they're putting a lot of time and blood and sweat and tears into every single comic. And especially if you're doing it month after month after month, it probably gets to be quite a blur. And so you start thinking, hey, this stuff should be worth more. But consider, if you will, the game developers and the game studios that may spend 2 to 3 years and hundreds of thousands of hours on something only to sell it for $49. I have a very good friend in the game industry, and it would always kill him when the games were discounted down to like 1995. It would be like, oh my god, I can't. It's like my baby's being sold off on the cheap. And if you think about it, Empire, I did this analysis, Marvel's Empire with a Y. At one point, with all the tie-ins and the crossovers and everything else, I think I had Empire up to about $175 for this event. That's a lot of money for one event. Now, granted, you're getting a lot of comics, but that's still a ton of cash. So I say all that, I probably spoke too much on the topic, to basically reaffirm, I think comics are too expensive in context with all the other entertainment options out there and kind of where they sit. They're also too expensive if they're going to try and grow new users. If you're going to get new readers, new subscribers, new people that are going to be all in on comics, you got to have a cheaper entry point than what we currently have. So some have made mention of like, hey, Alterna, they're the answer. They're going in cheap. Those comics are printed on newsprint and they're less money. So if everybody just did that, prices go down, problem solved. Well, not exactly. It is more complex. First off, you have the economy of comics is built on what it's currently making. And the challenge, I made this argument before, and some people have questioned it. And I'm glad, by the way, you have. Please never stop questioning what I say. I appreciate it. There's never any ego here about that. The comment I made is if you suddenly drop the comic price in half, you wouldn't get double the sales. Meaning, if a customer is going to come in and they say, they don't walk into a comic store saying, I'm going to spend $10 and they buy 2 comics. And if comics were half as expensive, they'd buy 4 comics. You might think that would be logical, but it's not. And trust me, from somebody who's run a store for 30 years, it doesn't work that way. Customers don't come in and they think I've got $20 to spend or I've got $10 to spend. They don't think that way. They think more like, I want to buy some comics. How many comics can I afford with the money I have? They don't do it the other direction. They don't do it of, I've got $20. Let me buy as many comics as I can for $20. Now, I don't mean nobody. I'm sure there are some people who do this, but not many. So the challenge is if you just kept everything else the same comics, same creative team, same page count, same everything else. Let's say you go ahead and put everything on newsprint, but other than that, everything else is the same, except the price is suddenly half as much. You wouldn't see double the sales. Now, you would see a sales increase. Don't get me wrong, you absolutely would. But the challenge is to somebody new coming into comics, they don't have any kind of value proposition in their mind. They don't come in and say, well, I'd like to buy $20 of comics. If this person is new, they might say, hey, I'd like to step into comics. I think I would do that for $2. I wouldn't do that for $4. And people might be thinking that, but they're not going to come in and say, hey, since it's only $2 and not $4, I think I'll buy two comics. They wouldn't do that. They don't have any context for the $4. They're just going to come in and try a comic. Now, over time, I do believe that if you lower the price in half, sales would go up and probably they would normalize out to a reasonable level, equivalent to what we're making now. But there would absolutely be a drop. We would fall before we rose back up again. And that fall would more than likely destroy the direct market. Not all of it. Many comic shops are, there's people who have the comic shops that specialize in back issues and all the rest, and that's fine. That's a model, but that's not a model that can support all the comic shops out there today. Meaning, if suddenly comic shops, the primary source of income was on the collector market with back issues, then you don't need you could do with a third or less of the comic shops out there today. So you would see a shrink no matter what. I but here's the problem. So you're kind of hearing me say two things out of my mouth. One, I'm saying that if you suddenly drop the prices, it would be catastrophic for the industry because that gap wouldn't be made up right away. On the other hand, you're hearing me say that over the course of, say, 5 years or so, it would probably normalize out and comic sales would rise and new people would come in at the cheaper price point and it would be healthy. So the question isn't, should we drop prices? We should. I think most reasonable people believe we should. The only people who argue kind of against a price drop are people that, believe that they somehow have the customers kind of stuck and they're going to buy whatever's put in front of them no matter what. And that's a dangerous way of thinking. It's an inaccurate way of thinking. It's a dangerous way of thinking. But the bigger problem is, how do we survive the gap? If we drop the price and we start to normalize things, which we should, how do you keep comic stores alive so they can keep selling the wares? Because if you take out the comic shops in this process, then no matter what new customers you're bringing in with a lower price point, you're going to be losing them with comic shops just closing and people not having access to comics. Now, one more little kind of mental leap to make here, and that's this. If product isn't available and the customer is not hooked on it, they're not a firm collector, then they're not going to reach out and try and find it. And the problem that comic books have today is it's not bringing enough new readers. It's not bringing in people who are unfamiliar with comics to be part of the the customer base. And that's the danger, because if you suddenly take out comic shops because they can't support themselves at the lower price point and still make a profit, and you start producing less comics because the entire comic industry can't support itself at that cost, and you haven't set up the newsstand or you haven't set up some other alternative method for people to get their hands on comics, if the only method is, say, Amazon or ordering from Midtown online, you are going to see a significant drop in sales and a significant shrinkage in new customer acquisition, new people coming into comics, because they're not going to know where to go. Part of what's a good thing, or part of what should be in terms of comics, is that the comic shops are out there. People are able to wander into them. People are interested in maybe pop culture. Maybe they saw a movie. They want to get involved in comics. Who knows? And the product is there. The comics and the store owner is friendly, and they get people into this community. But if that entry point doesn't exist, well, now we're saying that customers are going to have to self-service. And we know, particularly with Western buying habits, we know they don't do that well. This would be the customer who wants a comic book, has no shop on hand, goes online, self-selects without any help a comic shop online that can send them something, makes a purchase sight unseen, sits at home, waits for it to come in the mail, and then is happy and becomes a customer. The odds of that happening are very, very low. It's just not how consumer behavior works. So we're in a bit of a trap, everybody. That's why I think we're trying to sound the alarm and say there are real problems in comics we have to solve. It's why I do give as much airtime as I do to digital, because digital is one of those areas that is easier for self-selection. The key here is that we've got to get comics to new customers in a way that they'll accept them at a reasonable price. They'll buy them. They'll become interested in those stories, want to read more of them, and then they'll seek them out and become part of this overall customer line. That's what we need, and that is a very tricky proposition to put together. It is a hard problem. This is one reason why people say, well, why aren't you more in favor of crowdfunding? Okay, well, let's dissect crowdfunding for a moment. Those comics will work well for existing comic readers, people who already know comics exist, like comics, chances are collectors, they're interested in it, and therefore they are willing to self-find these comics out there, go to Indiegogo, or Kickstarter, which is not a place you would normally think to go. They would need to do some research, figure out the comic they want to buy, which is only going to work for existing comic readers. I mean, if say Sean Gordon Murphy has a crowdfunded comic, well, if you're new to comics, are you going to take a chance at buying in there? For some of these comics that are $25, $40 to buy in as a crowdfunded deal, if you are new to comics, you're not going to do that. That price point is way too high. And you don't know what you're going to get. You know nothing about comics. You're new to this. If you're an existing comic customer and you say like Sean Gordon Murphy and you liked his work on White Knight and you want more of his work, then yeah, this whole model makes complete sense to you. You know Sean Gordon Murphy, you can find him, you can see the comic, you can pay, and you can get it all works. You're already attuned to the collector model. But this isn't bringing in new people, or at least not fast enough. Now, again, nothing is in absolutes. Certainly, some people will find their way from nowhere, but you want to have as broad an entry point as possible. That's why the loss of the newsstand is so devastating for comics, because that was the primary way we got new people into the hobby. The loss of the newsstand plus the higher price point is a really tough thing to overcome. I do think, so in terms of talking around this whole issue, I do think we need to start lowering the price. I also think we need to start figuring out ways to give more for the existing price. So let's say you have this, let's go back to Dawn of X, or House of X, Powers of 10. Okay, we've got those two comics. Marvel wants to use this as a big jumping on point to the X-Men. Get a lot of new X-Men readers, basically grow that market. That's a great plan. So one way they could have done it and should have done it was to, with every physical comic purchase, you get 5 copies of the digital comic for free. Now, you might say, oh my God, that would be giving away way too much revenue. But the trick would be to encourage the people who bought the comic to share it. Give the digital code out to people who weren't normally going to buy this comic. Now, I actually think that would be quite successful. You got to figure out the right amount. Maybe 5's too many, maybe 3 free copies. The key is more than one. Kind of like, all these graphs we've been seeing because of this virus and how exponential growth works, that if one person has it, they give it to 3 people and the spread that happens. Think about it in a positive way for a moment with comic books. That's the kind of stuff we need to do. And so the only way I think we're going to lower the price is by stepping into it very carefully, step by step, and have very, very solid ways to grow the audience at the same time, or ideally before and faster, then we lower the price. We need to get new people into this market, giving them exposure to things. And I think there's a lot of tips and tricks and ways we can do that. The idea of giving out more digital copies per 1 unit sold is one way, but we need to start being creative. And that means that some people are going to make some less money. Some of the publishers are going to have to, do with a little less for a while. That's just what it's going to take. You need to invest in your business to grow it. What do you think? Where are the holes in my logic? I'd love to hear about it. So please, fill me in. Leave a comment below. Let me know where I've gone wrong, or question me. I'll go into this some more. Like, subscribe, introduce this to a friend. This channel, I'm trying to grow things as much as I can. So I'd love to have more people here. So by all means, subscribe, introduce to a friend. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook at Comic Perch, and thanks for listening.